Hey, APUSH gang. It looks like we are going to be virtual today. I just got a message from Mr. Mosley. It's actually Wednesday today, but I'm going to go ahead and record this. Excuse me. So the plan today is to do a final end run of the Civil War, which I did not finish on Tuesday. And then I'm going to do a quick recap of the era known as Reconstruction. So hopefully you took your binder home. If you did not, I will just listen. But before I go on, excuse me, the plan is to make the quiz available to you at, I think 12 o'clock. I have the quiz, but I'm gonna kind of go through it from last year and make sure that it's not secure questions and that it covers the things that we've covered in class since we switched books. So my plan is to open the quiz to you at 12 o'clock. I'm going to trust you not to use any outside sources to try to answer the questions, but that you will be people of character and that you will own it and do the best to your ability and then submit the quiz. Probably it won't be more than a 20 or 25-minute quiz. So I might put an SAQ question on it. I haven't decided yet. So to be continued. You'll find that out when you open the quiz. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into where we left off yesterday when we were walking through the Civil War. So my recollection is that we watched the death of Stonewall Jackson. We talked about the fact that after 1863 and the Emancipation Proclamation, that I'm not losing my voice. Don't know why I'm so hoarse, but after 1863 and the Emancipation Proclamation, Abraham Lincoln's intentions towards the war began to change. His primary goal when the war started was to preserve the Union. He had told the Southern states when he was elected or when he was running for re-election or running for election that he didn't intend on inserting himself into slavery that already existed in those states, but that instead he was focusing on not allowing it to spread to the West. But as the war continued to drag on, the catastrophic loss of life, he believed that it was an opportune time for our country to turn the page on slavery and to apply the promises of the Declaration of Independence, for instance, to all men, no matter the color of their skin. And so his vision begins to shift, and he begins to articulate that even in the Emancipation Proclamation, proclaiming that the slaves in those rebellious areas of the Confederacy would be henceforth and forever free. It implies that he foresees a future in which Black men and women are free. They are not enslaved. And so anyway, he begins to transition. So the Battle of Chancellorsville, Virginia, which is where Stonewall Jackson was shot and killed, was a fight for territory in Virginia. The Union Army was down in Virginia, and Jackson wanted them out of there. And so his army was very successful in repelling the Union Army back across the river. I'm not really sure what river, they didn't say what river they were referring to, but pushed them up north. And Robert E. Lee decided to take advantage and head up north again. The previous time that he had invaded the north was at Antietam, Maryland. Maryland was a border state that fought with the Union, but was also a slave state, so there was a lot of sympathy there. This time, Robert E. Lee is going to plunge into the belly of Pennsylvania, which is not going to be quite as friendly as the state of Maryland would be. Pennsylvania was illegal. Slavery was illegal in Pennsylvania, and actually a lot of the Underground Railroad and abolitionists lived in Pennsylvania, so it wasn't as friendly territory. But it was a border state in that it was right north of Virginia, so it was an easy call for him to head into Pennsylvania from where he was. Now, so Chancellorsville, the Battle of Chancellorsville has been called the prelude to Gettysburg. And as we talked about in class, Gettysburg is a 3-day battle. It sort of starts out as an accidental meeting of two armies. My puppies are sleeping, taking a ice nap because it's icing outside again. So if they start barking, I'm sorry. I will try to quell them if they do. I don't know what they hear, but anyway, so it was a 3-day battle. Some parts of a regiment had come into Gettysburg town, which was a pretty good sized town, looking for an opportunity to buy some shoes and some boots and some socks and things. A Union cavalry happened to intersect them, or actually they saw them from a distance, and so a general by the name of John Buford decided that he was going to dig in, and with the small amount of men that he had, he was going to hold the high ground, which he did. And so eventually what happens over the course of that evening, about 75,000 Confederate soldiers and 90,000 Union soldiers converge upon the town of Gettysburg. And so, as Robert E. Lee said, that this is not where he chose to have the battle, but this is where God had chosen the battle to happen. And so the armies were there, although he did not have the high ground, and it would not have been the place of his choosing. He was going to fight there. He actually hoped, again, remember, Gettysburg was a political calculation by Robert E. Lee. The re-election campaign of Abraham Lincoln is probably getting way. His re-election is only 18 months away, and Robert E. Lee hoped that by bringing the war to the North, that people would weary of the war and they would elect a president who would be more inclined to settle with the South rather than to fight on, as Lincoln was consigned to do. Lincoln wanted to fight on. He would accept nothing but an unconditional surrender on his terms. And so Robert E. Lee was hoping to change the course of politics, as they say. So the second day is famously the Battle of Little Round Top, when Colonel Lawrence Chamberlain of Maine and his regiment held the flank, I can't remember which side it was, but the far flank of the Union Army up in the hills above Gettysburg. They ran out of ammunition after multiple assaults by the Confederate Army, and so they charged them, and they basically tricked them into thinking that they were taking on the offensive, and so much of the Confederate Army on that side of the fighting surrendered. But the Battle of Little Round Top was a devastating loss for the Confederates as well as the Union Army, but the Union Army managed to hold the flank and prevented the Confederacy from swinging behind them and destroying them, which would have been catastrophic for the war effort. And then day 3, of course, was Pickett's charge. George Pickett was another general from Virginia, a little kind of a crazy guy. And Robert E. Lee tasked him and his men with marching through an open field uphill towards Seminary Ridge, which is where, I think it's called Seminary Ridge. It might have been Cemetery Ridge. I can't remember. Anyway, the high ground. And they got slaughtered, just absolutely slaughtered. Terrible decision on Robert E. Lee's part. He believed that they could take it, that the middle point of the Union Army was the weakest. But with the barrage of cannon fire coming down on them, he lost all kinds of generals. It was just a bloodbath. It was the high tide of the Confederacy because it was the farthest north that the Confederate Army ever achieved during the course of the war. And so, as I mentioned before, as Antietam, historians would say, I'm not sure how this is all going to turn out, because Antietam was not as decisive. Gettysburg was, I would say, decisive. It was a turning point in a way that Antietam wasn't. So Antietam equates to the Emancipation Proclamation and I would say, a turning of power, or but indecisive as to who the victor would be. But Gettysburg was a slaughter of the Confederate Army that Robert E. Lee never recouped from. His only hope of winning at this point is that Abraham Lincoln is not reelected, or that he can stay out of harm's way and continue to avoid the Union Army as it chased him down. So he goes back down into the South, primarily protecting the city of Richmond and the Confederate legislature and Jefferson Davis and all of those. And Ulysses S. Grant, who has had success at Vicksburg. After a several month siege of Vicksburg, the city of Vicksburg capitulates and surrenders on July 4th, 1863. So it was a celebratory weekend in the Union states, because July 1st, 2nd, 3rd, Gettysburg falls, and Lee retreats, and then on July 4th, Vicksburg falls. And so it's really just a matter of time at this point. And the dominoes just kind of begin to fall into place. So in your PowerPoint, I'm going to have to take a sneak peek here after Gettysburg. Let's see here. I think we stopped on the slide that had Abraham Lincoln's picture. I'm good. I know that you should be watching Heimler's history video, and he actually, I think, reads the entire Gettysburg Address in his video. It's a short little, maybe even 2-minute speech that Abraham Lincoln gave at the dedication of a Union cemetery at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. He was essentially consecrating those who had died in that fight. And historians would say that it is in the Gettysburg Address that Abraham Lincoln tactically or physically expresses his desire to abolish slavery forever. And so he uses the expression that a new birth of freedom will come now, that these men have not died in vain, but that a new birth of freedom will be for all men. He kind of quotes scripture a little bit and scriptural ideals. And there's no picture of Abraham Lincoln giving this speech because it was so short that the photographer didn't catch it. And so he gets up, gives the speech, sits back down. I guess the word on the street was like, well, that was a terrible speech. Like, really? That's all you got? And as it turns out, the Gettysburg Address is called the most influential speech of the 19th century. And so that is in I think, November of 1863. In the meantime, let me jump back in here. I was going to show you guys some, I'll see if I can find a couple of these video links that I was going to show in class. I own the movies. Another incredible movie for those of you that are history nerds and maybe have a little time on your hands with the snow. There's a movie called Lincoln where Daniel Day-Lewis plays the part of Abraham Lincoln. And it's really about the 13th Amendment, the passage of the 13th Amendment while Abraham Lincoln was still alive in the House of Representatives. They were having a hard time getting it through the House. And an amendment to the Constitution has to go through 2 processes. According to the Constitution, it has to be introduced in the House and Senate by 2/3 vote, and then it has to be approved of by the state legislatures or special state conventions in 3/4 of the states. So it's a pretty high bar to cross or to jump over. And Lincoln wanted to make sure that it had already passed through the Senate a couple years before, but it was stuck in the House, even though the southern states were not seated there. So if he couldn't get it through in the House when the southern states were not seated in the House of Representatives during the war, how on earth was he going to get it pushed through the House of Representatives once the southern states rejoined the Union? And so he knew he had a small window of time to make that happen. So anyway, I was going to show you some video clips about that, but I don't have the ability to do that unless I can find them on YouTube, and I'll see if I can. So in the meantime, so Lincoln's kind of got that in the back of his mind. In the meantime, he has once again fired another general. He fires George Meade because George Meade didn't go after Robert E. Lee when he had the chance, when he was on the run. And so he replaces him with Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant has been making history, making the news, just killing it out west and on the Mississippi River and Vicksburg. And so Lincoln thinks he's got what it takes. He is invincible in some ways. He doesn't count the body count like McClellan does. He has a lot of people under. He has lots of soldiers. He has lots to lose in that he has more that he can lose and fight on, I guess is what I'm going to say. So he had a couple of nicknames. One of them was Unconditional Surrender Grant, and I may have mentioned this to you the other day because he always insisted on surrender in his terms, and he was also referred to as the Butcher because he lost so many men, but he fought on. He was persistent. He did not let that stop him. He continued to fight. And of course, in his situation, as I said, he had a wealth of people available to him to fight on. And so he did. And so shortly after the fall of Vicksburg, I think it was in March of 1864, Abraham Lincoln appoints Ulysses S. Grant to be the commander of all Union forces. Grant in turn appoints his good friend, whom he has fought with, William Sherman, to also fight in the South, in Georgia, South Carolina, etc. So these are the final, essentially, the final days of the war. He makes that switch. Now, right in the middle of that, as Grant and Sherman are considering how do we bring this thing to an end, there's an election, and Abraham Lincoln is up for re-election in 1864. The Republican Party is a little nervous. They're a new party, but they hold on to Abraham Lincoln, but they changed their name in a lot of the print. They refer to themselves, let me see if I've got this written down here. Sometimes they refer to themselves as the National Union Party, and your book even named another name, but this was a name that our previous history book called them. Just to distance themselves a little bit from the blood of the war. And because of all of these victories and success that the Union Army was having, and the fact that the Union Army almost exclusively voted for Abraham Lincoln versus George McClellan, which is interesting. The Democrats nominate George McClellan to run for president, and George McClellan, of course, has a vendetta against Abraham Lincoln. But George McClellan's terms for ending the war was concession. He was going to just end the war and everybody go back to the way things were. He was not an unconditional surrender, end slavery, follow our rules. He just wanted peace. And that was, of course, very appealing to the Southerners. But the Southerners weren't voting because they were not a part of the Union at this time. And so even though the Army tended to love George McClellan, I think they saw this is a, not treasonous act, but stabbing Abraham Lincoln in the back by running for president. So they predominantly voted for Abraham Lincoln, which won him the election. And so Abraham Lincoln is reelected. He chose Andrew Johnson to be his vice president in the reelection campaign because Andrew Johnson was the only Southern Democrat who stayed loyal to the Union. He was from Tennessee. And so they thought that would get him some votes with the Northern Democrats, and it does. So he's reelected. And so then William Sherman and Ulysses S. Grant meet to discuss the final days of the war. Grant sends Sherman south to Georgia, and Ulysses S. Grant heads up to the northern part of Virginia to chase Robert E. Lee. And so that's what's happening towards the end of the war. And of course, all of the major cities on the Mississippi River, for the most part, except for maybe Mobile Bay, have been captured. Ulysses S. Grant and Sherman employ what's known as total war. I've got some definitions here, but essentially, total war was not the freedom to kill civilians and rape women and do horrible things. Total war meant that civilian property and livelihood was at their disposal to do with what they wanted, the Union Army, because by destroying civilian property and their ability to provide for their families would kill morale and would also hopefully bring their desire to fight to a screeching halt. It was effectively kind of what Robert E. Lee was thinking in the North, but of course he wasn't destroying civilian property. Interesting thing that William Sherman did was that when he headed towards Georgia, he cut off communication with Grant and Abraham Lincoln. He literally cut the telegraph lines. He did not want to have to answer for what he was about to do. And so essentially, after burning Atlanta, Georgia to the ground, he turned towards Savannah and started to march towards Savannah and destroyed everything. And I don't know, I've read different 60 to 80 mile swath. I think he had 60,000 men that traveled with him, and they had no supply lines, and so they ate off the land. They would, from town to town, they would confiscate pigs and cows, and they would hunt, and they would gather the harvest, and they would eat off the land. They would go into people's homes and clean their shelves. I'm sure many of them took little souvenirs for themselves. Probably stole things from private property from people's houses. As far as I know, there's no widespread suggestion that there was any violation of women and that sort of thing that sometimes gets wrapped up in the story of Sherman's March to the Sea. I've never read anything that indicated that. There was a lot of stealing and that sort of thing, but I think they believed it was justified as part of the total war. Another thing that he did was he instructed his men to destroy all the railroad lines along the way. So they would tear the tracks up and they would melt them down. They would tie them around trees, and they would call those Sherman's ties. And then Sherman's sentinels were the brick fireplace towers that were left when everything else was burned. And so he marched all the way from Atlanta, Georgia, across Georgia to Savannah, Georgia at the sea. By the time he reached Savannah, the mayor of Savannah made a deal with him and said, please don't destroy our city. We'll let you stay here for the winter. And so Savannah was spared. Unfortunately, then Sherman turned towards South Carolina, and he famously said, this is where the rebellion began. This is where it will stop, or something along those lines. And he really did more damage in South Carolina than he had done in Georgia. By the time he reached North Carolina, on his way back up to Northern Virginia to help Ulysses S. Grant, when they crossed over into North Carolina was already in the process of trying to readmit into the Union. They were handing out blankets and food and acting like the heroes. And so Georgia and South Carolina got the brunt of it. And there's still a lot of bad feelings, I would say, amongst the older population in the South because of Sherman's march. Eventually, Sherman meets up with Ulysses S. Grant, and they do trap Robert E. Lee, and he is forced to surrender. Let's see here. There's a couple other slides here I'm going to kind of ignore. You can read over yourself. Once they believe that the war. Oh, the other thing I was going to say is that in addition to his men that were traveling with him through Georgia, there were also thousands of slaves that literally dropped everything they were doing and began to follow the caravan. So by the time Ulysses S. Grant enters into North Carolina, there are almost 25,000 free blacks traveling with the Union Army and needing to be fed and those sorts of things. Famously, William Sherman promised those freed slaves that he was going to arrange it so that they would receive 40 acres to farm and a mule from the federal government in exchange for their years of slavery, so that they could get a head start. And so essentially what he was planning was taking the land from those in the Confederate states that were in rebellion and divvying them out to the slave or the former slave families, so that they kind of as a concession for their years of slavery, and to help them, assist them in starting a new life. And it was, I think, about a year in the making. And so they received the land, they received the mules, they began to farm the land, and eventually a case worked its way through this, I think all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government, the Army in particular, did not have the right to confiscate public or private property and to redistribute it to the slaves, no matter the reason. And so after a year of farming and clearing and harvesting, that land was taken away from those people, which was absolutely devastating to them. So if you ever hear or see in writing 40 acres and a mule, that was specifically William Sherman's promise to free black Americans. That's what that is. So, and then again, it goes back to the 13th Amendment. Abraham Lincoln had about 20 or 21 votes that he had to turn to get it across the finish line, and with some conniving, probably a little bit of legal bribery jobs and spoil system type stuff, his people managed to convince about, I think it was actually +3 to +2, so 22 or 23 of those members of Congress that had voted against the 13th Amendment to switch their vote. And so on, I think it was January 31st or February 1st, let me look and see. Yep, January 31st, the House of Representatives joined the Senate in passing the resolution to the 13th Amendment, and then it went out to the states, and 3/4 or more of the states voted for the passage of the 13th Amendment by the end of that year. So by December 31st, 1865, the 13th Amendment was enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, and finally, slavery was abolished. Let's see here. Okay. As you know, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated a week after Robert E. Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse village, and sadly, Abraham Lincoln only lived a week after that surrender. There were still some armies fighting out west, but Lee's army was the one that they were trying to get to. So Abraham Lincoln was shot on Good Friday. Let's see here, April 14th, 1865. He died the next morning in a row house across the street from Ford's Theater. There's a picture at the end of your handout. I think I included it. It shows a picture of Abraham Lincoln at the beginning of his term and then at the end of his life, and it's staggering how different he looks, how worn out. Looks like he's died 1,000 times over in the course of those 4 years. Okay, so let's shift from that to Reconstruction. Blah. Okay, so Reconstruction was just a terrible time in American history, and it set the stage for 100 years of black codes and Jim Crow and racial segregation and a whole bunch of horrible stuff in the South. But essentially, Reconstruction was that period of time at the end of the war, 1865, to the election of Rutherford B. Hayes in 1877. So it was about a 12-year period of time. The word Reconstruction is the idea that our country was trying to, our politicians were trying to reconstruct the country, trying to figure out a means by which southern states could re-enter the Union, become full-fledged voting members of Congress. They needed to re-elect people to serve in their state governments, rewrite their constitutions, vote for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, everybody get on the same page, and then hopefully move forward. But as you know, the Southern economy has been absolutely decimated. Their slave labor, or their labor force, is gone. Well, it's sort of gone. A lot of them are gone, but a lot of them stayed behind hoping to farm their own land. And there was obviously lots of opportunity because there was lots of land, lots of plantations, but the labor force was gone. And there was a lot of bad feelings. There was a lot of racism. The KKK comes to light during this time in an attempt to terrorize Southern whites who were in favor or supported the newly free Black Americans and the Republican Party. The Republican Party dominated Southern politics during this transition, and the KKK was determined to remove them from power and replace them with the Southern Democrats, who would prevent Black people from voting because Black people voted for Republicans. It was a mess. And of course, during this time, you have lynchings and just a whole bunch of nasty stuff. So it got really ugly. And I like to say that the words of William Lloyd Garrison, who was the Northern abolitionist who wrote or was publisher of the Liberator magazine, an abolitionist magazine, famously believed in moral suasion, in which he proclaimed the evils of slavery and admonished people who supported it, tried to change their heart because he didn't believe that laws would change the country. And he was right. He was spot on. He believed that unless you persuaded a person that slavery was immoral, immoral, that it was a stain upon humanity, that if people didn't feel that in their heart of hearts, that they would continue to be prejudiced towards people with different color skin. And he was right. He was spot on. The laws completely changed over the course of the next 12 years, but the hearts of Southerners in particular, and Northerners to some degree, did not change. There was still an attitude of superiority of whites towards Blacks that had to work itself out over time. And because of the war and because of military occupation of the South and William Sherman and Abraham Lincoln being gone and a lack of leadership, Southerners kind of dug in. And unfortunately, free Black Americans paid the price, as did a lot of white Northerners who came down to assist. I don't know if your book says this, but a couple of the previous history books that I've read cited sources that said during Reconstruction that thousands of people were killed or assassinated by the Klan during those years in an attempt to terrorize them to prevent black people from voting and from Republicans from holding office in the South. So here is, I'm going to just go through this really quickly, and then hopefully you will pick up the gaps from reading over the PowerPoint and watching the Heimler videos. I would also recommend John Green's Crash Course Reconstruction. It's really good. I'll probably send you a link to that as well. So the presidents of Reconstruction are, you can throw Abraham Lincoln at the beginning of that because he actually started his plans for Reconstruction in 1863, and he called them the 10% plan. The idea Lincoln believed was that he did not want to punish the South any more than they were already suffering, but instead, if there were 10% of the eligible voting population would take a pledge of loyalty to the Union, that state could begin to form a new constitution and elect new leaders and that sort of thing, and move towards readmission into the Union. But when he died, his vice president had to take that over. So the two primary periods of time in Reconstruction, what was known as presidential Reconstruction, which happened under Andrew Jackson from 1865 to 1867, only lasted about 2 years. But the radical Republicans wanted to go all out crazy on the Southerners. They wanted immediate emancipation. They wanted all of the states to ratify all of the 3 emancipation amendments, so the 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment defined that those people who had previously been in servitude were now citizens, because Southerners were saying, well, fine, slavery's over, but they're not citizens. They don't have the right to protection of our laws. They don't have the right to vote, those sorts of things. And so they had to clarify it by creating another amendment. The 14th Amendment clarified that those previously enslaved are now citizens. And then to protect their right to vote, because again, apparently it wasn't clear enough, the 14th Amendment provided the language by which it said that black men could not be prohibited from voting. So it was a protection of black voting rights. So freedom, emancipation, citizenship definition, and then black voting rights. That's how 13th, 14th, and 15th. And so Southern states wanting to enter the Union had to vote in behalf of all 3 of those amendments. So the radical Republicans they passed a couple of laws, the Reconstruction Act of 1866 and 67. Anyway, the laws, let me look and see what the names of the laws are. I just went completely blank. I think it was the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the Reconstruction Act of 1867. Both of those laws, I think they were both vetoed by Andrew Johnson, but for the first time in history, there were enough votes in Congress to override a presidential veto. And of course, that's because there were no Southern states that were seated. And so they overrode his veto. And the Reconstruction Act of 1867 is when Congress takes over Reconstruction. So they basically pushed Andrew Johnson aside because they could override all of his vetoes. They took control of Reconstruction, and sometimes that period is also referred to as radical Reconstruction because the radical Republicans were in the seat. And they are the ones that sent troops down to the South and insisted that it be militarized zones by which the country's army would protect the rights of Black Americans. The Freedmen's Bureau was introduced during this time, which was paid for by tax dollars. And so people went down south. Sometimes they were referred to as carpetbaggers. They would go down south. They would work for the Freedmen's Bureau. They would teach Black people how to read and write, help them find their family members that had been lost during slavery. They set up a school system for Blacks. Were very supportive of Blacks, but it was a very costly tax dollar paid program that eventually Northerners didn't want to pay for anymore. And so this presence of Union troops and this influx of Northerners coming into the South to help created, again, a lot of animosity. And so as the KKK rose during radical Reconstruction, during Ulysses S. Grant's presidency, the first 4 years he squashed it pretty good, but he kind of ran out of steam. People were tired they just wanted to go on with their lives. The war was behind them. The Union was saved. Slavery was abolished. Can't we just move on? That's what Northerners were thinking. But Southern Blacks were thinking, please don't abandon us. If you abandon us, everything's going to go back to the way it was, minus slavery. We're going to have no rights under the Constitution, or they're not going to be protected. But unfortunately, that's what happened. So in Ulysses S. Grant, so it's Andrew Johnson was president for 4 years, and then Ulysses S. Grant was president for 8 years. Grant started strong and then just took a nosedive. And by the end of Reconstruction, the KKK was essentially alive and well and running the show, assassinating people, running the Republicans out of office, preventing black people from voting. I read somewhere that said at the beginning of Reconstruction, 90% of eligible black men were voting. By the end of Reconstruction, as you pass into the Jim, or the black codes and the Jim Crow era, only 3% of Southern blacks were practicing or voting, which is staggering. So the KKK and the political system of the Southern Democrats was successful in repressing the black vote. But the final nail in the coffin of Reconstruction was when in 1877 there was an election between Samuel Tilden, I believe, the Democrat, and Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican. And I think Samuel Tilden won the popular vote, but neither candidate won the Electoral College. And there were several states that were halfway in, halfway out, and their elections were super crooked. For instance, Florida was a debacle. And so the Republicans said this is not a true election, it's a faulty election, these results don't mean anything. And so for, I think, the third time in history, they convened a committee in the House to try to figure out who was going to be the next president. And what ended up happening, the Democrats didn't really care who was president as long as the Union troops would get out of the South and they could be back in the saddle again. And so they came up with a deal. They presented, it was called the Compromise of 1877. And the Southern Democrats told the Republicans, we'll let you have the White House if you promise to remove all of the troops that remain in the South, get them out of there, and let us just do our thing. And so the Republicans agreed to it because they so desperately wanted to hold on to the White House. Rutherford B. Hayes became president, and unfortunately a curtain fell upon the South that lasted for 100 years until the 1950s and 1960s, when the civil rights movement finally gained some steam. Segregation was the law of the land in the South, and those attitudes were perpetuated amongst the communities and the families and the churches of the South, sadly. And so that brought a close to Reconstruction. Well, that was the fastest I've ever taught Reconstruction. So I'm going to upload this video. I will make the quiz available to you at noon. This should give you plenty of time to watch this video, and hopefully you are all ready to go. So I think that's it. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Bye.